Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Neurotransformations, where we discuss healing and transformations. I'm here today with Tommy, and Tommy has an incredible story that you need to tune in for. Tommy is an eating disorder specialist, and he's going to tell you how he got into this, and I'm going to interview him about his story, what his past looked like, what it looks like now in this present day, and where Tommy is headed in life. And I really appreciate you coming on here today, Tommy.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me on. I love all the work that you do, and it's really great to get these kind of words out here because these kind of topics aren't talked about enough. And I think what you're doing is really creating that conversation and changing lives as well.
Amen. I agree wholeheartedly. We need to get this conversation out more, that you can change, that you can transform. It is possible. And you're going to hear today just exactly how Tommy went through some really wild stuff from what I understand and how he got here today. So can you kind of like draw us back to your childhood and where you grew up, what your background is, and kind of what you had to go through to get to where you are today?
Yeah, well, I've obviously grew up in Ayrshire in Scotland, which is just about 30 miles from Glasgow. So it's quite a coastal area with a lot of beaches and things around here. So obviously, Scotland, not great weather at the best of times, but I grew up basically, my childhood was great, apart from primary school where I did face a lot of bullying, I must admit. But kind of taking you back to everything about where I grew up and things like my mother, basically, she suffered for 17 years with various different types of cancers, which actually started as cancer in the womb when she was giving birth to me. And it wouldn't be until she actually passed away that I found out that she actually had the option of obviously having me and living with the cancer, or aborting me and possibly being free of the cancer. And that would lead on to the situation that we'll talk about further on. But my childhood was, like I say, it was really, really great. I was really into football. So I ended up becoming a semi-professional footballer. I was playing with Scotland under 17s and Greenock Morton, which is a team here in Scotland, and I had various other football clubs looking at me. So things really kind of changed round about when I was about 17 years old. My grandfather, who was my mum's dad, he was somebody that I could always tell everything to. If I had any worry at all, I would go to him and he would be the one that would kind of speak to me. And he was always somebody that he would speak openly to me about things that he kind of held into himself. He was a World War II veteran and things, and he was captured by the Japanese and things at one point. So he was a hero in life. He was basically somebody that brought up 5 kids on his own, held down multiple jobs. He was an amazing, amazing person. He was definitely, I would say, my hero in life. And he passed away in October 1997. And at that point, I remember going to register his death with my mum and my uncle Ian at that point, and we were sitting out the birth, deaths, and marriages office. And I turned round to my mum and I said, "Look, I'm going to give up things like sweets, pizzas, anything that I considered like treats, which they're not treats. That was just how I considered them at that point." And my mum turned round to me and she said, "Well, why would you want to do that? Your grandfather wouldn't want you hurt yourself." And I just said, "I don't see any point anymore." And then the month after that, my mum passed away due to the cancer, basically because I think she kind of gave up, because her reason for keep going was to look after my grandfather and things. And I think that she had instilled all this way for me to look after myself. Like she learned me everything about how to care for myself. And it kind of took the fight out of it, I think, really. And at that point, I just kind of self-destructed. It got to the point I was exercising for like 15 hours a day. I was basically surviving on big bottles of Pepsi Max soda and maybe an apple a day. And I was going back and forward to the doctor for almost 3 years, from the year 1997 through to the year 2000, basically saying that I was losing weight. I felt that I just wasn't coping properly. He kept telling me I was suffering from grief, which obviously that was a big part of it. That was the catalyst for things, because what would lead to what would be an eating disorder further down the line, I believe that's a coping mechanism. So he didn't really kind of recognize anything about eating disorders. And to be honest, in 1997, I didn't even know anything about an eating disorder because you never really heard about it.
Right.
So right through to the year 2000, like I say, I was constantly being given antidepressants, basically sent away. It got to the point I just kind of gave up because I wasn't being listened to. And I actually decided to go to visit my family over in Australia. And to kind of put you in the picture, two of my cousins over in Australia actually had eating disorders as well. So it does have that genetic component as well, which I now know, obviously. I went over to visit them against doctor's orders because the doctor said to me, look, if you go over there, you probably won't make it back. And I obviously didn't believe him because I thought, look, you keep giving me antidepressants, you keep saying there's nothing wrong with me, that I will get better. I just don't believe you. So I went away there and my holiday got cut short. I actually had a 6-month visa. It ended up getting cut short to 2 months because I started to suffer potassium, magnesium, and phosphate loss, basically because at that point I was obviously binging and purging, which obviously caused all that kind of the kind of mineral loss in my body, and I was starting to suffer like cardiac arrhythmia and things. So I get sent back to Glasgow, and on arriving back at Glasgow to check into the hospital, I just remember getting to the airport and I seen all these stars shooting in front of my eyes, and basically obviously must have collapsed. And I woke up and it was 4 months later at this point. I had actually been in a potassium coma for 3 months and I'd actually suffered a massive heart attack. And that's actually when they diagnosed me as actually having an eating disorder. So it had taken for that kind of really serious stage for me to get diagnosis. But in the hospital, I get put in touch with a great community support team. I actually thought that the eating disorder was totally behind me, because when you've got an eating disorder, you've got this voice screaming at you 24/7, because your life is controlled by, it's like an addiction to steps, calories, numbers, and obviously exercise, because you've got to follow through that everything the eating disorder voice tells you. So that had went away, and I thought, great, I was obviously back out in the community after a year. I've been fed through a peg tube into my stomach, which is a feeding tube into my stomach. And then for the next couple of years, I get back to work, but I had suffered sciatic nerve damage below my left knee, basically due to the loss of weight from the eating disorder. So that cost me my footballing career. But I ended up working in a factory that was like a kind of warehousing place that I worked at. So things were at least going at least in the right direction. And then I met what would soon to be my wife, and we got married in 2006. And then she suffered what they thought was polycystic ovarian syndrome. It actually turned out it was actually ovarian cancer, and she had 4 miscarriages due to that. And she required a full hysterectomy. And then obviously due to that, I suffered another relapse, a second heart attack. Actually, my organs were starting to shut down, so my kidneys and my liver were obviously failing. And when they took me into hospital, I was suffering from what they call refeeding syndrome. That's basically where they start to add calories to your body, but your body rejects it, and it can actually cause you basically to die right away. So it was a gradual refeeding process of like 100 calories for 2 weeks, right up to 2,000 over. It almost took like 6 months to get to that period. I get back out of hospital. I was at a point where I could be looked after in the community at this point, but I was never really getting myself better. It was almost like what I would call quasi recovery. So I was doing enough to stay out into the community, but basically to protect myself from getting hospitalised, really. And the reason for this was my dad had suffered type 1 diabetes all his life. He ended up having a massive stroke, which paralysed him all down his right side. And me and my wife were caring for him 24/7. So I was obviously worried about losing him, not really getting to that point of recovering. And then 2014, he actually suffered a second stroke. He was taken into hospital, and he suffered a massive heart attack while he was in hospital. So it was a process of like 4 weeks of him basically just his heart not pumping properly, and it was just a waiting game, really. And then he passed away, like I say, 2014 at that point, and I suffered a massive relapse again. Same situation. My kidneys were shutting down and things. ended up getting put on like kind of a renal program and things. Then I was in the hospital for almost a year, and at that point, something really kind of clicked within me, because my father had always said to me, like, don't do it for me, don't do it for your wife. You've really got to want to do it for yourself, because I had always wanted to do it for them and kind of everybody else. And I feel that when you've got an eating disorder or any addiction, you've really not got to want to do it for external reasons. You've really want to go to do it for yourself. And I wanted to do it for their memory as well. At that point, I really, for the last almost 7 years, I've been fully recovered. I now obviously do a lot of ambassador work for BEAT, which is a national eating disorder charity in the UK. So I support people through their helplines. So like people can phone in their helpline or their web chats, can be anorexia, bulimia, even carers and things. So they've got separate chats for all them. And I do a lot of work through that. I do obviously a lot of ambassador work through like my work in the media, speaking about my eating disorder, kind of breaking down the stigma that surrounds men with eating disorders. And I've actually became a personal trainer and nutritionist, so I work with people in that kind of area as well. So it's been a real tough journey, but I'm glad to actually say that the eating disorder is fully behind me now, and I feel that I've actually moved forward. But it's taken that 20 years of journey, and I want to kind of stress to people that it doesn't matter how long you suffer with an eating disorder, you can recover, but it's really, really important to get that early intervention, because I believe if I had got help really early on and I had been listened to and they'd have known enough about eating disorders, I probably wouldn't have had that long 20 years of suffering and to get to the place that I am.
Wow, man. Yeah. It's you mentioned how it's sort of like an addictive compulsion to not want to eat. And typically I associate eating disorders are in society are associated with only women. You don't think of like a man. And obviously your short story shows how that's not the case, and men can suffer too, just in the same aspect. And because I've been had a long history of addiction, alcohol abuse, drug abuse. I understand that compulsive nature, that impulse that we all have sometimes, in that inner voice that really can sabotage you and wreck you. And I wanted to know more about eating disorders, as far as the aspect of what what did you learn in the recovery process? Like what were like the fundamental things, or like the insights that you had that was able to take you from continuously relapsing to like, oh, okay, well, maybe I do got this. Did somebody say something to you, or did you have an insight?
Well, personally, I think everybody's different, but for myself personally, it was almost like I had became sick and tired of being sick and tired, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I just lost so much of life that I realized that I've really got to want to do this, because it was as if something had clicked in me. And it's sad to say, but it almost like I had to almost lose everything to kind of get myself back. But it can be different for everybody. But I think what's really important is you constantly challenge the eating disorder voice, because if you don't do that, that's where you stay in that quasi state of recovery. And that's the point that a lot of people actually get stuck at, because it's almost like you do want to recover, but the biggest fear of recovery is actually gaining weight. But you don't understand that that is 50% of the process. You've actually got to do that. But the other 50% is nutritional rehabilitation is the 50% to start with, but then it's the neural rewiring process. But you can't actually do that neural rewiring process until you've dealt with the nutritional rehabilitation, because a starved mind doesn't obviously let you do that. So that's the difficult part of it. And that's the kind of thing I try to stress to people, that it's really difficult to move past that. And the way I did it was basically by eating by the clock, because when you've got an eating disorder, your stomach's shrunk, you don't have those hunger cues sent to your brain, because your brain's shut off from that. So I had to really kind of train my brain to eat properly. So it was like every 2 hours constantly doing it. And what I would do is, when the eating disorder voice was shouting at me when I was eating every 2 hours, I would basically use like distraction. So I've done a lot of kind of coping mechanisms like meditation, breath work, EFT tapping, which I felt was really massive for me. Even journaling, because for myself, I had bottled up a lot of things what I blamed myself for. Obviously, the passing of my mum, various other things. So journaling and getting that out there was really cathartic for me. So that's kind of things that I would kind of really recommend to people as well. But you brought up a great point as well. That obviously men with eating disorders, they actually say that 25% of men actually have eating disorders. To be honest, it's much, much higher. I think it's actually 50-50 across the gender divide, because men don't come forward due to that stigma. But as well, which a lot of people don't look at as well, bigorexia, so men using steroids, going to the gym and things, that goes under the radar because exercise is socially acceptable, as we call it. It's what people kind of push forward. That is an eating disorder in itself, but eating disorders, I'm actually only a small portion of the actual people that you would represent with eating disorders, because anorexia, they actually say it is like between 5 and 10% of the people that have actually got eating disorders, because people think eating disorders are actually about a thin, frail look. In reality, it's things like binge eating disorder and bulimia that are actually the biggest eating disorders. So people that you would look at and think that they look healthy, they're actually the people that are actually suffering the most, because eating disorders are not about the body image or anything else, or the representation of the body mass index. It's actually the issues that's going on in your head. And that's one thing that I would really kind of stress about that as well.
That's very informational. I didn't know a lot of those statistics, and I think about fasting a lot because I do know that, you know, intermittent fasting and long exposure to fast, like a week-long fast, like it can do some really powerful things to you. Like it can boost HGH levels, and it can really you know, help the mitochondria do its thing and really kind of be like a spring cleaning for your brain and body. But I would caution people when if you're gonna fast to be aware of stories like his, because if you're not really conscious of what you're doing and what you're putting into your body, and like actually if you go, you don't want to overdo it, you know, like because you know there's stories like this. And just if you're a man and you have an eating disorder, reach out to somebody, reach out, because you're not alone. And I've never had eating disorders really, but I've had lots of mental health disorders, and those are all connected, you know, that depression or whatever that causes that compulsion. And also you mentioned an excellent point that your dad said before he passed away, that it's inside of you, you know, it's great to have outside goals.
Yeah.
You have to look inside for like, why am I doing this? Like, what's your heart's calling? And Tommy, what a few more questions I had about eating disorders that I didn't have any idea about was what you mentioned, like potassium levels, and a lot of people don't understand the importance of certain chemicals like potassium, magnesium, like having enough salt. So I'm sure you, along your journey, you learned a lot about that. Can you just tell us a little bit about explain a little bit more the chemistry behind that?
Well, obviously things like potassium regulates your heartbeat. So things like cardiac arrhythmia, which happens a lot in eating disorders, that's usually the reason. A lot of people suffer from neurological issues. So obviously I spoke about the sciatic nerve damage below my left knee. That's caused a lot by things like magnesium and phosphate. They control a lot of your central nervous system. So your nerves, your obviously your brain and things like that, your cognitive function, that's all part of that as well. So they're usually ones that a lot of people suffer with. But the potassium loss usually is caused mostly by either some form of purging, which can either by obviously vomiting, laxative abuse, which happens a lot in eating disorders, something I suffered with as well. That's usually the biggest part of it.
Yeah, and I was aware of potassium and magnesium deficiency. I didn't really know much about the phosphate, but do you supplement with magnesium and potassium and phosphate?
Yeah, I do. I've been doing right since I obviously had the eating disorder. It's been something they've actually kept me prescribed on from a general practitioner. Basically, I've been kept on that for life, just for precautionary reasons. I probably don't really need it now because a supplement, I would always say to people, get your supplements through your diet. But when
Yeah.
you've got something like an eating disorder, it's always a grey area. It's best to try and base it, get what you need, and obviously try to supplement as well.
Yeah, I knew that magnesium, a lot of people don't get enough nutrition because foods these days don't have the same amount of
Absolutely.
nutrition in them as they used to in the past. And so that's why I supplement, and it's not something I like religiously talk about, but I
Yeah.
do know that it is important because the foods are lacking in what foods have like a lot of potassium in them?
Well, things like bananas. Bananas are one of the highest. You've got mushrooms, which is another. That's the kind of ones I would recommend. Broccoli's another one as well.
Broccoli, okay. And what about phosphate?
Phosphate. Oh, no, you're asking. Phosphate. I can't remember offhand, to be honest, for phosphate.
No, that's okay. I get it. And yeah, we could definitely look that up. It's just I don't supplement with potassium or phosphate, but now that you've kind of introduced this to me, I'm gonna think about doing it, or at least make sure that my levels are good. And what
No, see when it's came to me now. See when you're talking about phosphate, things like obviously your red meat, your dairy, seafood's another one. Another one that I did do a lot was things like nuts, like Brazil nuts, things like that. Really, that's
yeah,
the kind
yeah.
of
Brazil nuts. I used to eat a lot of Brazil nuts, and they're delicious. I don't I stopped buying them. I don't know why I got off that. They were so good. But yeah, so what are some like recommendations for just like young men out there that are really struggling with eating disorders, or they're dealing with anxiety or depression? What would you say to like a young man that kind of was hopeless, feeling hopeless, like I'm sure you did throughout your journey? Like what could you tell him?
Well, I think the biggest thing to really do, and which is really powerful, is try to open up to somebody. It can be anybody you trust, whether that's a family member, a friend. It's really great now. You've got things like the National Eating Disorder Association in the US. You've got BEAT, which is BEAT, Eating Disorders UK, if you're in the UK. These charities, you can go on there anonymously, and they've got things like peer support groups where you can speak to people. They'll signpost you to things in your area that can obviously help support you. And most of the time, you're actually speaking to a lived experience ambassador, which is somebody that's been through an eating disorder themselves. I feel if I had that when I had an eating disorder all those years ago, that would have helped me a lot. Actually, having people that can understand and have been through that journey and can obviously help and support you with a clinical experienced person with them as well, which I think is really, really important. So having those kind of resources is really, really great. But always, I think the first port of call should be your GP, your general practitioner. Go and speak to them and try and get the help you need. And if you don't get the help, keep looking at somebody else. Don't give up right away. Go to another doctor. Keep speaking. Keep voicing your opinions, because eating disorders thrive in secrecy. And the biggest part, actually, recovery is taking back that secrecy and speaking about your eating disorder and telling people that you're struggling, because that's when you really move past these things. Because I always believe that eating disorders in general, or any addiction, are actually a coping mechanism for something, because it's almost like your genetics load the gun, but your environment pulls the trigger. And it can be bullying, it can be stress. For myself, it was obviously grief. It can be anything in your life, like environmental pressures, like your work or anything, because there is that genetic component as well. And I think that it's really important that we stress that. And actually, the earlier you can go and get the help that you need, it's really, really important. Because with eating disorders in general, they get to the point that they're really ingrained. So it's all about neural rewiring. The earlier intervention you can get, the easier it is to actually recover, and also to not suffer all the health complications that come down the line, because eating disorders are mental illnesses with physical symptoms, and that's really, really important to understand as well.
Yeah, dude, the root causation, it's important to think about, okay, have this activity, I have this addiction, but what's underneath that? What's fueling that? It can be emotions or thoughts, or like you said, environmental, genetics. And that's really important about the genetics, because a lot of times these days people are discounting genetics, and it does play a role. Like my whole family, I've had a lot of issues with alcohol abuse. On my mom's side, my two uncles are both heavy alcoholics, and my grandpa on my dad's side, he was a drinker and a functioning alcoholic. And so there absolutely is a genetic component. And I think some of this tough guy mentality is out there a lot. Like, and there's nothing wrong with that drill sergeant mentality. Like get up, it's, no excuses and that thing. That's great. But you also have to take into consideration, like, if I'm not the same as Michael Jordan. I don't think I could have ever have been the best basketball player like LeBron James or somebody like that. There's a genetic component, and we have to realize that. Like, don't discount that, but don't let that be your excuse either, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point that you brought up about the tough guy mentality. And that is the thing that prevents people coming forward, getting the help they need. And the sad reality is, it's not always actually the eating disorder symptoms that actually kill people. It's actually because they end up taking their own lives because they basically can't get the help they actually need. And basically the eating disorder becomes their identity and it consumes them. So that's the truth of it. Eating disorders actually have the highest mortality of all mental illnesses, which a lot of people actually understand as well.
Yeah, I had no idea about that, but that's the main thing. It's like, well, the culture and the ego, the masculine ego is such a thing. Like, it doesn't matter what anybody told you. It's important that you get a hold of this. It's important that you take control and like realize that there may be some emotional components. And yeah, it's almost shocking in a way, like that that society, there's a lot of societal issues, but it's almost shocking that especially with something like eating disorders for men, like it's just not understood, or nobody knows about it. And so this is important to bring this subject to light. But so I want to know, kind of, I know where you are right now, and what is kind of like a long-term goal for you, or vision that you've got going on?
Yeah, well, really, it's just trying to change the perception of men and eating disorders in general. It's trying to help people come forward, because I've noticed I started speaking about my eating disorder almost 8, 9 years ago, and at that point, there wasn't any men actually coming forward and getting the help they need. So when I was in hospital, I was basically sent into a psychiatric ward, so they didn't really understand anything about eating disorders. They were basically sitting outside a room watching me 24/7, basically just watching my eating, taking me to the toilet and things. And it was in there that I understood that I needed to really open up about my eating disorder and actually help people get the help they need because of that misunderstanding of it. And through that, I've had men coming forward to me, like through emails, YouTube, Instagram, speaking about their eating disorder, even females as well that weren't getting the help they need. So it's both sides. So what I want to really do is I want to really try and help people as much as I possibly can, whether that be through my experience, my coaching, my words that I speak on the media and things. I just want to help people. I feel that that's where life's role. I feel that we go through these troubles for a certain reason, and I always used to hold that tight and think that I didn't have a reason in life. Now I see that we don't go through these things for no reason. I feel that we're here for a certain reason, and that I feel that I probably had to go through that to then do what I'm doing now. So I feel that that's my purpose, and that's really what I want to do.
That's brilliant, man. I feel very similar because I went through brain surgery and brain trauma,
Yeah.
epilepsy. I've had grand mal seizures. You were having heart attacks, which is it's just unbelievable story. And make sure that you check out Tommy. Make sure you check out his profile and look at this transformation, because it's spectacular. Like, to see where he is and where he is now. Where can anybody reach out to you on social media? What is your platform?
Yeah, well, I'm on Instagram a lot at flow_fitness and mental health, and I'm on YouTube, Flow Fitness and Mental Health. And you can email me at flowfitness@gmail.com as well.
Okay, and I'm gonna make sure to put that on the bottom of the description on here when I share it. It was a true pleasure to have you on this, and yeah, well, hopefully we'll have more discussions in the future about this, because it's an important topic, and you got a heart of a lion, dude. You really do, and
Right back at you.
you do. It's a crazy, amazing story, and um, two guys that have found their purpose through having to go through shitholes. To
Yeah,
be frank, but
absolutely.
that's the interesting thing about life is, you know, a lot of times our suffering is what brings us to a greater understanding.
Yeah.
So, once again, I appreciate you having me on,
Thanks
Tommy,
very
and
much. I really appreciate it.
we'll be in contact.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.